Hey, did you know that Ghibli animated on an American cartoon once? Not just any American cartoon, it was actually the Batman-Superman crossover World's Finest. Part 2 to be pretty precise.
My, you do live dangerously. Don't you realize you're moving in on Superman's main squeeze?
Wait a minute, no. I see the credits, it says TMS. TMS worked on this. I love Tokyo movie Shinsha. They're my favorite. How could you possibly tell me Ghibli did it when it says they did not? That is misinformation. You are a liar. Liar! It's just a cartoon, come on. Look, what we have to start with is that TMS is a big company and has many different animation studios within it. One of them is called Telecom, and they are the reason that Ghibli ended up in this episode. They're a subsidiary of TMS, who mainly works on international projects, and they've been working with Warner Brothers for quite some time, including to today. I mean, I don't know if I want to see a Rick and Morty anime, but I guess it's happening. So in Japan, Telecom is probably best known for working on a lot of the Lupin franchise, doing a lot of the high-end stuff on them. Pretty good stuff. And that's where Miyazaki comes in. You see, he used to work there in the late 70s to the 80s, training staff, being an animator and all that good stuff, before eventually, you know how it goes. But Telecom and Studio Ghibli have a good relationship. The president and Miyazaki, they're good friends. And Telecom has done, God, it must be almost 8 or 9 films with the studio in terms of sort of behind the scenes roles, a lot of in-betweens and other sort of cleanup processes. Some of it uncredited, some of it's credited. They're a really strong relationship. And in particular, they had a very important role in the film Princess Mononoke. A film that was so big that it almost didn't get finished in time. And it's only because of Telecom that it did. See, they weren't just doing in-betweens, they were doing key animation, they were painting it, they were doing cleanup, they were doing everything on it. But they also had a bunch of other stuff to work on, so Ghibli and Telecom had to wager a deal. It is the 90s. Studio Ghibli has built its own studio, and they want to keep their staff in-house. And to do that involves giving them more salary positions and, you know, keeping it in the family. But the problem is, what happens when you're short-staffed? Well, you try and get some freelancers first, and then you realize your infamous reputation makes it very hard to do that. So they've been relying, especially on Princess Mononoke, to fill in the blanks with Telecom. If you want to learn more about Miyazaki and sort of wacky adventures in Telecom, you can definitely read this interview with Takeuchi, the old president, down below. It's on Full Frontal. Mwah. And Takeuchi is very important here, because he's the one that made this deal happen, right? He was the guy that said, okay, we will help on Princess Mononoke, but you need to do something for us. If you can help us on 2 TV productions, we'll help you back. Now, he's doing an old trick here. He's being a little tricky here. He didn't tell them that one of them was an hour-long special. Telecom was pretty well known within Batman the Animated Series for doing some of the best episodes of the show, especially when it came to animation. And that's why they got another 10 episodes of Season 2 of Superman that they had to deal with, including the special. And that's a lot of work. So, of course, they began outsourcing some of that to Studio Ghibli. Now, there's a difference between producing animation and animating it, right? So what they've done here is they've gave Ghibli these cuts to sort of ease up their workload. Doing this sort of thing was not even uncommon for Telecom, as mentioned here by Bruce Timm himself in the commentary for Batman Beyond.
Now this sequence here, I'm not positive, we haven't actually gotten any official confirmation on that, but this sequence actually looks very much like it was done in Korea by Coco, the animation studio that does our TV series. I have a feeling what happened is that TMS basically ran out of time and resources themselves in the course of doing this picture, and farmed out a number of sequences to Coco in the Orient.
This is not even that uncommon for Ghibli. They've done a ton of work helping out other studios in the past, including the infamous episode 11 of Evangelion. Even though they aren't credited anywhere, everybody knows they did it, and it was even mentioned on DVDs later on. So let's go through the timeline. Well, The staff get back from their break on May 20th, and that's when they start prepping for Superman. The day afterwards, the production desk has a meeting with Telecom that goes 8 hours where they deal with all the specifics of the production. If it be the storyboards, asking questions, delegating cuts, everything, because it's an in-house production. And looking at it then, they were then given episode 40, or production number 40, which was part 2 of World's Finest. And they had to finish it in about 2 months. Now, Ghibli's usual pace is about 5 minutes per month, so they had to really speed up if they wanted to get this out in time. Now, let's have a look through the credits for Part 2 of World's Finest, because I know some people are probably convinced enough by the TMS thing to not understand what we're talking about here. Starting with Misako Shinohara, who has been working with Miyazaki since the 60s, and has pretty much been at Ghibli since day one, working all the way up to Howl's Moving Castle. Apparently this is one of her cuts. Very nice. And then we have Atsuko Otani, who's been working at the studio since Castle in the Sky all the way to Wind Rises, and she's done some hard as hell cuts. I mean, look at that from Princess Mononoke. Mwah. These are the 2 veterans, and the next 4 staff are the sort of younger key animators who all came up from in-betweens in the 90s sometimes to slowly make their way to key animation on Princess Mononoke. Because what's going to tie all these people together is, effectively, they all happen to have worked on Princess Mononoke. Notably, Takeshi Inomura, who was fairly young now, he would go on to be one of the animation directors, or supervisors they call them in Ghibli, of Howl's Moving Castle. Speaking of animation directors, we have Hideaki Yoshio, who is the animation director this time, a prolific key animator on Princess Mononoke, and did well enough to handle the whole production. As a animation director, he will be looking through every frame and correcting and making sure it is on model with the style which he is obviously not familiar with. Yes, and the same story goes with the in-betweeners, who also all came off in-house production at Studio Ghibli. Notably, one of the more interesting choices here is David Encinas, who is a French graduate of
Gobelin, l'école de l'image,
which seems to be a pretty prolific French animation school, who ended up just in the middle of the 90s going to Japan and working at Ghibli for several years. I bet he has some really interesting stories. Wink, wink. Okay, and I actually talked to David, and he gave me some insight into the production, including that, yes, it was an in-house production. All these people are salary workers for the most part. He said there might have been some freelancers at Ghibli, but he didn't know. But it is at Ghibli when this is happening, and there is definitely more than 6 key animators and assistant animators on this production as well. That was too low. That's the main credited crew of the episode. And of course, the supervisors and the checkers are going to be at Telecom. So they're going to be the people that are going to look over what Ghibli's done and send it back if it's not good enough. But again, we have to consider this is an American pipeline. So this episode isn't going to magically turn into an episode of Studio Ghibli work. They're trying to work within a very specific pipeline. And that begins with Paul Dini and Alan filling out a story that is then filled out more by one of the TV writers for all the dialogue and extra stuff, and that being sent to the storyboard department of Telecom. They ask their questions, they write the storyboards, it gets approved, and those storyboards were then given to Studio Ghibli in that 8-hour meeting, and then they would have been deferred to the different animators.
Don't worry. I'm taking Lois quite seriously. Besides, it seems to me you had your chance.
There's a little difference in the flourishes. Some really juicy touches, like Bruce's eat shit little eyebrow he gives and the wink to Clark here. What about Harley and Joker together? They're actually very affectionate this episode. I don't know if I've ever seen them this sweet before. It's unusual. And of course, how could I forget to mention the entire Ghibli hair extravaganza that Harley pulls off in this little sequence. And I don't think it's the only time it happens in this episode.
Street pizza. In this town, some flying fool could have caught him.
Speaking of Ghibli, I think the most, quote, Ghibli-esque cut probably comes in this sequence, which has a very Castle in the Sky vibe to it. But there is probably a reason for that, especially even when we get to things like the airship there. The person who storyboarded part of this episode is Toma Naga. Toma Naga is a Telecom staple who's worked with Miyazaki fair bit in the past, and in particular when it comes to Ghibli films, he worked on Castle in the Sky. There's something about the episode in terms of how on model it is. Now, this isn't as bad as that Evangelion episode, and that's likely because of the checks and retake system being much stricter. but it's just not as tight as Telecom's other episodes. And I think that is most obvious when it comes to Batman. I don't think he looks particularly bad, but sometimes the construction of the face and the shape of stuff just doesn't quite feel right. And I gotta say, despite this episode being seemingly on a pretty tight deadline, there are some really fantastic little touches of animation here. Like this dance Joker gives is so over the top, and I love it. And okay, I've shown you the most Ghibli moment. Let me show you the most Paul Dini, Bruce Timm moment I could think of. We've got both of their original OCs having a bit of a wrestle, and if you know, you know. That's all I'm gonna say.
Yeah, anytime you have your strong, strapping, masculine hero getting his butt kicked by a couple of girls, it's always a good thrill.
Yeah.
They were about a week late on the deadline, and I almost don't want to be too harsh on them for that, because, well, it's pretty obvious that it's going to happen with Ghibli. They were bamboozled. Somewhere towards the middle of June, I think. I'll put the day on the screen here. Telecom came to the office, and they dropped off a bunch more storyboards, namely half of the ones from the final part 3, and told them, yeah, you're animating these two, by the way. So when Kazuyoshi Tanaka from the production desk saw the storyboards that they had been given for part 3, and knowing when the episode needed to come out, he was freaking out a little bit internally. They gave them some absurd cuts to do on that episode, it seems. It's hard to know exactly the ones they did, but there's a couple where I'm like, okay, there's no way they didn't give that one to the studio, because most of the ones I'm thinking of are Nausicaa homages, and I can't help but feel like that was Tomonaga, because some of them are references to a dear friend of his, Yoshinori Kaneda. And this is when my third eye opens up, right? I'm looking at episode 3, part 3, World's Finest, and I'm seeing the scenes where I'm like, okay, that's business as usual. Suddenly, the animation pacing changes, the way it moves. There's a thing in Ghibli where you put most of the stress of the frames at the front, but also there's just less frames because I think of their time. They're not quite as flowing, let's say. There's not as quite full animation as last time. So that's happening, and sometimes, obviously, not quite as correct. So that's happening, right? My third eye is opening. I'm seeing the scene, and I'm suddenly like, this is Ghibli, that's Ghibli, that's Ghibli. And then there's some really intensive cuts, especially when it comes to mecha. And it made me start thinking about who's on the team, or who is on the credited team at least. No key animators are credited for this episode from Ghibli, but the animation director is, and there are only 6 slots. So I can't help but feel, especially with what I know from what happened in the production diary, that basically the same crew is on this episode in half those cuts, just not in the American credits. Every in-betweener is still Studio Ghibli's entourage, including a very particular one, which is actually spelt wrong. Yonebayashi, the director of When Marnie Was There, who started not so long ago at Ghibli as an in-betweener on Princess Mononoke. So this would track in timeline-wise, but he would then go on to become a trainer and then a director at the studio, and then go and create his own studio, Studio Ponok. So if that's the case, very interesting. I think another way that you can tell the slight differences is that Ghibli just isn't used to doing lip sync animation, as well as the full animation motions. So sometimes the motions and the voices, they don't quite match up. It feels like they don't quite know where the emphasis in the sentence is. And there is actually a benefit to sometimes being off model, because it means, like in anime, you have a little bit more style, a little more flourish. I mean, look at this. This white man can jump. I have never seen Batman in this series jump that high before, and it is amazing. It's pretty much just Kamen Rider kicking right there. Beautiful. Apparently, it was actually approved by Warner, though. Bruce Timm and that. They thought it was. They thought that Telecom could handle it, and I think they were correct. And considering now they're dealing with deities and aliens, yeah, why not? Why not push the boundaries? So one of the animators from the prior episode, Iko Kuwana, leaves the studio sometime after this year, and he does a lot of freelance work on mecha shows. And I do wonder, it's my speculation, I'm not sure if this is true, if he was quite involved in a lot of the robot drawing in this episode, because there are definitely times when you can tell this robot isn't necessarily matching the rest of the scenery. as much stylistically. Sometimes it's double shaded, sometimes it's not. It moves incredibly efficiently though. I imagine this is where most of the production went, because as we go through this episode, you will see towards the end, the production looks like it is falling apart, and likely because it is being rushed right to the finish line a little bit. But the scenes that need to look great look absolutely fantastic. All right, well, there you go. They finished it. Wow, it happened eventually. They got there, a little bit rougher around the edges at times, but they really did it. So I got to thank my patrons for letting me take a little distraction. If that would be Ashkarao, Takayuki Suzuki, Doji, Steven's mum, Lenny, Tim James Richards, Cell Swords, Fox Mulder, Joven, Daniel Strait, Chunks, Jay, Systematic, Paul, Subsofa, Stratogen, Stratos, and OT. Starting a new series too on there called Steven's Anime Corner, where I go through anime I've watched recently or stuff from my good old bookshelf that's in every episode. Wait a minute. I feel like something's off here. This doesn't actually feel like the end. I mean, that looked like 2 productions, right? Oh, well, I guess it wasn't, because it seems like the train doesn't stop here, and Ghibli was working on one more episode, specifically a Batman, called Growing Pains. Now, it looks like with this one they had more time. I'm assuming they could have went from that deadline straight into this production all the way to October. Because even more so, I would say Ghibli is pretty much completely invisible here. There's not really much issue with sort of off-modelness. It looks pretty sharp for the most part. There are a couple little bits, but we'll get to that later. David confirmed to me that this was an in-house production. They animated this whole episode as well. But the major difference is that Telecom's production supervisor, Tomisawa, was in-house at Ghibli through the layout and key animation production points. So he was keeping an eye on the whole thing, making sure it was going smoothly. Starting with who actually directed this episode. We didn't really mention too much about the director last time. He was a Telecom staple, but this time it seems a bit more interesting to bring up because it's Atsuko Tanaka, who was a Telecom staple. They also have a very storied history with Miyazaki. They've worked on, I think, at least 12, 13 of his productions over the years. Here she is at his 60th birthday party. But they also ended up doing episode direction at Telecom towards the 90s. While she does have a reputation for doing some really good food cuts, she's actually an incredibly versatile animator, and probably the reason that she was loaned by Telecom on Princess Mononoke and did about 10 minutes of key animation in that film over something like 8+ months. Insane. And there are some slight differences in credits this time. It looks like the majority of the in-betweeners, from what I can tell, are not exactly the exact same ones, but definitely ones that worked in the prior production. But there are a couple changes in names when it comes to the key animators. 4 of them are the same, but we've got Mariko Matsuo and Al Kagawa? Well, okay, that is a blatant spelling error. So Ai-chan, as they're sometimes known at Ghibli, is Megumi Kagawa. She is one of the best animators in the company. Her nickname was Ai-chan, which means love, and I guess they accidentally mistranslated that as Al. Yeah, but having a veteran like that on board, on top of the other ones, definitely seems to give this production more stability. A reason that usually animators can be quite invisible in these sort of productions, especially on the American side, is the retake system. And a good example of that will be Clayface Part 1. This is an episode from years back that, in a commentary, Bruce Timm once said it took about 2 or 3 retakes for them to get the episode to look, quote, not cringeworthy. It was a real strain. It was basically a new animation studio who hadn't worked with them before, so they were having quite a difficult time working with the classic character designs. So when they got Part 2 and gave it to Telecom, yes, Telecom's a great studio, but I don't think they were really expecting the absolute insanity they were given back. It was, in some ways, jaw-dropping. It knocked Tim off his butt.
No! Hayden's gone! Make him stop haunting me!
If we're going to do another Clayface episode, I'm sure they were like, well, we have to get Telecom back. And funnily enough, Telecom gave it and outsourced it to a different studio entirely. For the most part, it seems. But one that's definitely suited for the production. So most of the episode is pretty smooth. Like, if we begin here, there's some nice bike cuts in this opening here, lots of articulate movement, fun action scenes, some good chases, stuff like that, but nothing out of the ordinary. But the last 5 minutes is where it really starts rocking.
Besides, it won't be the same this time. You're here to protect me.
As soon as Robin does this very cartoonish fall, which I think is pretty funny, yeah, things start changing and we start seeing the tendrils come out, the clay animation. And yeah, I imagine this is where you need your animation support, absolutely, because that's full animation, that's intensive, and it reminds me very much so of the work a lot of these animators just came off on Princess Mononoke with the demon spirit boar scene at the beginning, which took them years to finish, especially on the in-betweens. Just so much work, and some of these animators certainly helped during those sequences, so it would make sense that they are being brought on here, and they do a fantastic job with the sequence. I think there's so much going on in this episode here in terms of how bleak it gets and just the style of the animation. Towards the end as well, Robin getting really angry, the face really goes off model, but in quite fun ways in terms of he's just so angry. I've never seen Tim Drake Robin that angry before. It's a fun thing to see, and just the amount of emotional reverence coming at the end there with the splashing and smashing, and it wouldn't be Batman the Animated Series if you didn't have a nice little explosion at the end. It's actually a really bitter episode towards it. There is no like silver lining here at all, and it comes together to be pretty good. I don't know if it's as beloved as World's Finest, but definitely a highlight. It does sound like they were running on empty towards the end because they were losing their breaks, working Sundays, Saturdays, every day, making sure that this time they were not late. And it seems like they hit that deadline eventually. Now, a lot of people, I guess, have an opinion, like they have a brand idea of what Ghibli is. They would not sully themselves in the TV animation space, but that's just not really true. I mean, a lot of studios give favors and take favors and help out, and Ghibli is no stranger to that. They usually do it on movies, but there's actually another documented case where this happened that isn't talked about very much, and I've got proof of it. I had to check it up. It took me hours, but I found it. There is a complete collection of Cardcaptor Sakura that has the whole staff list for each episode. It's not in the credits. I had a look. It's not there. But if you go through it, you can see that Ghibli assisted on episode 26 of Sakura. And when I was looking, I was like, oh, this is the round episode. And then instantly I was like, that's it. That's why this episode's so round. It's a Ghibli episode, of course. That's less noticeable on like Sakura, but it's still, you still can tell. I mean, it looks like they had about half the cuts on the episode from my assumption looking at which cuts look that way, because there's about another 9 animators from Madhouse on it. Now, why did that happen? This is obviously a favor just before the beginning of the production of Spirited Away, which Madhouse did quite a bit of support on, and they also got their Korean partner to also help on that film. Hey, they may have even got their Korean partner to help them color frames digitally in the last movie. So this is all about handshakes. So what's the point of all this? Well, I thought it was a fun little fact to put on Twitter, and it kind of blew up sometimes in my face. But there was kind of a point I wanted to make about the company name in the credits is not the be-all end-all. And so much work in animation is invisible. And it's kind of a little bit sad sometimes because a lot of that invisible work is completely uncredited. We may never know the people who've done our favorite cuts sometimes. Even on Princess Mononoke, right? There's so much work on Princess Mononoke. Like, there's just like 6 different companies on paints. There's 6 different companies on in-betweens. There's a couple digital companies. I know Telecom must have done some more key animation on it. And in between and every... Who knows? Who knows which staff members actually fully worked on the whole thing? We only know so much of that story. And a lot of that gets washed away. Thanks to the work of a couple extra people, including Full Frontal's translator, who helped actually concretely put down the rest of the production diary. So we had like this is what happened, not like bad machine translations. This is what happened then, this is what happened then, on the production, because only half of it is actually in the Art of Princess Mononoke book. And also talking to David himself, who was very helpful during this video, the man who was actually on the ground, being able to chat for me for a second. I really appreciate that he gave the time for him to do that with me. And stay tuned for the Princess Mononoke video.